Hello all, my name is Yasmin, but everybody calls me Yaya, and this week is very special to me because it is my birthday week. My birthday is tomorrow, and I am throwing a Victorian-themed brunch with my friends and I'm taking it very seriously. I'm going to explore what life was like in Palestine, what the Victorian era really is, who was populating the region, how did it slowly emerge, what was significant about that time, and plenty more. And I will be talking about it while I do this very modern and simple attempt at a Victorian makeup look. So what is the Victorian era anyway? So the Victorian era is when Queen Victoria had her reign over the British Empire, specifically Britain and Ireland. And it lasted for about 63 years, between 1837 to 1901 when she passed. And this era marks significant historical events, like the abolishment of slavery happened a couple years before Queen Victoria became queen, but in this era essentially. And the first electric telegraph was also sent during this era. The first modern railroad was also opened during this time, and there were also calls for a more democratic political system which didn't require ownership for anyone to run for parliament. This was also during the time of the Irish famine, or otherwise known as the Great Hunger, and that led to 1 to 2 million people leaving Ireland to go to cities in North America and in Great Britain. This era was also when Charles Darwin published his book about natural selection, which was known as On the Origin of a Species. And if you're somewhat familiar with Darwin's theory, it's very controversial, though many have accepted it as fact, unfortunately, but that's a conversation for another day. Okay, so that's an idea of what was going on in Europe, or specifically Great Britain and Ireland, but what was going on in Palestine during the Victorian era? Well, towards the end of this era, by 1890, there were about 532,000 people within Palestine, and that consisted of 432,000 Muslims, 57,000 Christians, and 43,000 Jews. Over 84,000 Jewish people were immigrating to Palestine between 1850 to the end of World War I, or the beginning of World War I, which was 1914. And across all communities, it was estimated that women were popping out at least 9 children per woman, or somewhere around that. So the population was growing very rapidly, and it was basically a very delicate balance of religions within the nation. And yes, I know I'm going very hard with the blush, but I'm trying to be on theme here, so let's see. Okay, so those were the demographics of the country, but the economy was an agrarian economy, which basically means it was based on agriculture and land over industry. And this was dominated by a family-based economy, which just means that family members would make up the workforce for each family unit or business, I guess you could say. But at the same time, there were also plenty of local markets and trade happening within the region. Okay, now at this time, Jewish people were mostly living in urban areas like Jerusalem and Hebron, and Christians and Muslims were scattered out throughout more of the rural areas. When Palestine was divided into 3 districts. There was the Sanjak of Jerusalem, which was governed by Constantinople, and then the 2 northern districts of Nablus, which is where my family's from, and Akka, which were part of the Beirut province. Now at this time, the millet system was in force, which basically allowed for religions to kind of govern their own communities, and different religious groups had autonomy in educational and legal matters. Now, I mentioned earlier that the first roadway was established in Great Britain at this time, but there was also a railway constructed in Jerusalem as well. And there were also plenty of port improvements, and European companies contributed a lot to the developments in this region. Now, this was partially due to the major influx of European immigrants to the region, many of which were religious pilgrimages to the region, with over 10,000 European visitors visiting annually by the 1900s. And Jaffa was the main entry point for pilgrims entering into Jerusalem, which is why there are plenty of Europeans settled in Israel right now. Now, at this time, there was an active missionary presence with Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant institutions competing against each other. So now at this point, there was a very active European pilgrimage to Jerusalem and Palestine as a whole. And there were a little under 2,000 European travelogues that shared accounts on people's experience in the region, though they mostly focused on religious sites more than they did contemporary life. Okay, so many like Christians viewed Jerusalem from a biblical or religious lens, and this is also during the time of the emergence of Zionism. So there was an emphasis on the returning of Christ for the second time. In order for that to happen, it's believed that Jews have to resettle in the land, which is basically what Zionism is. Okay, so that was kind of the situation at that point. I feel like this is not giving what I want it to. Okay, so this was supposed to be a heart, so I'm gonna go ahead and redo that because that is not giving. But let's continue the talk. So while all of this emergence to Europe was coming and all these travelogues were emerging, there are books that we can read now that really show like exactly what Europeans were encountering when they were coming to Palestine. And there's one specifically, and it speaks about Palestine during the Victorian age, and it emphasizes the hospitality of the Palestinians, and they were very, welcoming to the European travelers, which is kind of contradictory to what a lot of like Orientalist perspectives would say, but these accounts actually showed otherwise. So at this time, Europeans who kind of traveled the land, specifically Christians really, were able to kind of give literature or produce literature that shared insight on the holy sites that were in Jerusalem. And this kind of stuff was really only accessible to like the affluent people during the Victorian era, and not so much just everyone else. But this influx of European immigrants allowed this to become accessible to everyone. And as Britain became more aligned with the idea of restoration, it kind of encouraged or pushed for the emergence of peaceful domination, or like a peaceful crusade, which meant dominating the area. Now this peaceful crusade focused on religious, cultural, missionary, and philanthropical activities to kind of establish British dominance in the region. And many accounts really kind of glorified Palestine as a site that was once home to a lot of violence, to still being of interest to a religious person. There was an Irish traveler who went to Palestine, and in one of his diaries, he specifically wrote that a church is to a city what Palestine is to the world. So there was a lot of emphasis on the religious significance to religious people, and unfortunately it came at the cost of everyone already living there regardless of their religion. Now unfortunately this led to kind of an emergence of false information, right? Like, so Zionism would push for the need for Jews to settle there, and they would emphasize like how Jewish people would bring like advanced farming systems that would help the people living there, though the land itself was doing very well agriculturally, but there had to be like some kind of concrete reason to convince people that coming there and settling the land was for the betterment of all, right? So they had to kind of have a self-righteous ploy in there to convince people that like what they're doing was right, though it didn't have any like basis and fact, like Palestine was doing just fine. It was already being sustainably farmed before Zionist settlers and Christian settlers started to go over there. Now, not every American or European settler had interest in Zionism. For example, there was a guy named Edmund. His full name was Edmund Robinson. He was a US settler in North America, but he did not want any part of Zionism. But then you have people like Charles Warren and Claude Coder, who were part of the Palestine Exploration Fund, which helped Zionism a lot. And they were very favorable to the idea of Jewish settlers colonizing Palestine, and they contributed to the creation of Israel. Now, most Victorian settlers at the time imagined a submissive indigenous population, but they were quickly proved wrong when the Palestinians would resist through their anti-colonial struggles. And while there were a mix of accounts of travelogues from the region, some which tried to undermine like Palestinian autonomy and emphasize the idea, just like any colonizer would, that Palestinians couldn't really speak for themselves or represent themselves, and that they needed an outsider to kind of help them out. There were also those that countered that, and there were some that revealed that there were plenty of practices that try to legitimize Jewish settlement into the region by replacing Arabic names within the area with Hebrew names to try to make it more authentic and make it seem like there was more of an indigenous connection to Palestine from these European Jewish settlers. Now, we've seen this in many instances in history, right, where colonizers will come in and try to rewrite how things really went down, just to kind of not just get support, but sort of solidify their claim on the territories that they wish to conquer. And it has been proven very effective before. We've seen it done with the Native Americans, and we see it all over Africa and in parts of Asia as well. And the effects of British colonization, European colonization in general, they still remain, as we can see, and it's just kind of what happened. Now, despite all this, there was still life in the region. Like, there were still plenty of people who had a normal kind of existence, people from all faiths, and you can see that here, and it is very heavily documented as well, but sometimes you have to dig for those, but that's why I am sharing here so you guys can take a look at it. Okay, so now despite all the attempts of colonizers to kind of make it seem like their invasions of places like Palestine and places all over the world are valid by attempting to rewrite history or put things into a certain perspective, the truth remains, and we have plenty of evidence showing what life was like before them, and that there was peaceful coexistence of all religions, and that there wasn't a need for domination of just one religion for the place to be what it is. Now, as far as the Victorian makeup look goes, I think all it is just a lot of blush. As you can see, a dark mole and maybe a heavy eye look. I try to stay away from my brows and my eyes because I just got my lashes and my brows done because my birthday is tomorrow and I want everything to look perfect. But I hope you guys got the gist. I hope you guys learned something new about what Palestine was like during the Victorian era. If you did, let me know if you learned anything in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know if you guys like this kind of content. Let me know if there's any particular era or region you'd like me to explore or any particular topics. I'll see you on the next one, and as always, all sources in the comments.